Smokies, how y'all going? I thought I'd take a moment to record the second lecture for week 6 for HSP216. We are talking about police ethics because it is intimately entwined with police corruption and deviance, which is what we talked about in the first lecture. So I'm going to step through a few of the issues that emerge around police ethics and some of the different ways that we can think about this and make ethical decisions and all of that sort of stuff. Ultimately, by the end of this lecture, I really just hope you get to know what ethical thinking means a little bit more in terms of ethical thinking frameworks, and how this can actually assist with police deviance and corruption. So it's not a huge thing. I'm not asking you to be experts on how to make ethical decisions. That's probably another entire PhD course. But at least you'll have some sense of what these ideas are and how they drive police practice, hopefully. We do have this ideal in our minds of an ethical police service and what they are supposed to look like. And there are some different models and I suppose factors or characteristics that we would hope that an ethical police service would embody or be characterized by. So this includes things like not having any corruption, being honest, having restraint in their use of force, not having incompetence if possible, no acceptance of gratuities or graft and things like that. They have integrity, so trust, competence, professionalism, confidence, all of that sort of stuff, and a lack of what they talk about as us and them, which is they are the public and we are the us, I guess, and this massive divide between the two of them. Everything done in private spaces with police officers, we would hope that they were done as if they were in public, such as police use of force, so that if people were around watching, it wouldn't then influence what the outcome would be. They would still do things in reasonable ways and obviously prioritise human rights. Policies would be informed by a consideration of justice. Mistakes would be treated as opportunities for learning. And of course, we wouldn't have any bigotry. Now, this is an ideal, which is a kind of utopian vision, but it's almost impossible to achieve 100% of the time. At least that's what the research tells us. Because there's so many different things which inform policing. And it does really operate in a netherworld just beyond the limits of respectability. So what guides police deviance then? And it's very typically how we think about ethics that guides these forms of corruption and deviance and misconduct in everyday life. Nehru talks about how there's been a number of different, I suppose, stages or phases or even crises of policing ethics. There was, typically these are motivated by particular policing incidents, and all of them have ethics that tie into them in some way. Of course, there's around police professionalism. So I suppose we look at that in terms of 1980s policing and 70s policing and Queensland Police Service, for instance, where there was substantial corruption going on. Then we've got a crisis of police discretion, which is where they have a lot of discretion to make decisions about whether or not to prosecute, but they ignore that discretion and they continue to prosecute regardless. We have significant crises of covert policing. The incredibly challenging practices that were engaged in by London Metropolitan Police and other police services in the UK around environmental activist groups very much fall into this category. I'm not going to talk about this now, but if you're interested, have a Google. It's a really fascinating example. And of course, we've got other forms of different types of police corruption that I've just talked about in my last lecture. More recently, we've got things like police use of force and wrongful death, which keep emerging over and over again. And I would argue that we're probably not getting as much traction with in processes like civilian complaint processes and court processes because very few officers are being disciplined or removed from their police organisations as a result. Now, there are many philosophical frameworks that talk about how we need to use ethics in different workplaces and things like that, and also in policing environments, but I'm not going to talk about them. You can certainly read about those in your spare time if you'd like to. One model, though, is this very simple ends means test, which Nehrude and Beckley talk about. Is the end good? Yes. Then, we move down to the next bit. If it's not, then stop. Can the means work? If that's correct. If it's not, you stop. If it's correct, then you move to another bit. Is there a less harmful alternative? No, then we need to repeat that little process again. If there is a less harmful alternative, does it undermine some equal or more important value? No, then we proceed. If yes, then we stop. Now, this is a very simple model, but it is one that's useful, and you can actually enact that quite quickly in a process where you are on the ground. You've got minutes to think about it, perhaps not seconds, but certainly minutes to think about it. You could go through this process, have a little bit of a think, and then come back to that person depending on what the circumstances are. Now, as I mentioned, you do need a bit of time to go through this process. So the ends means test is not always easy when you've got instantaneous decisions. And police officers a lot of the time do have just seconds to make a very critical decision about what's going on around them. Correct training procedures can usually ensure that officers will make the right decision if they have the time, but sometimes it's just also not possible at all. So what about good policing? And Nehrude and Beckley talk about this notion of good policing, and they explain it in a little bit more detail. Now, I'm not going to go through the explanations, but I will just read out very quickly the principles that they put together in this particular model. So respect for personal autonomy, beneficence and non-maleficence. Justice is another very important one. Responsibility is very important. Care is absolutely important. And of course, honesty in addition to stewardship. Now, all of these ideas, they say, come together in this idea of good policing that we should be working towards in some form or another to inform training and the way that that happens, in addition to informing the everyday police work that happens on the ground. This model is particularly good, which is why I wanted to give you a snapshot of it, but you can read more about it in different sources if you want. There is then a question that emerges. How should the principles be used? How might they be applied? And how might they impact on policing overall? Now, Nehrude argues that it's human rights that help us to enable a process of what we call decision-making calculus. It introduces the notion of proportionality, and this ensures a balance of means and end in those decision-making processes. Human rights frameworks will often talk about these things, and I've given you a couple of examples of different links to these frameworks. But we can see in Article 4 of the, I think it's the International Human Rights Standards for Law Enforcement, we can see that they've got a section called Utilisation of Proper Means to Gain Proper Ends. The law enforcement officer shall be mindful of gendered language, his responsibility to pay strict heed to the selection of means in discharging the duties of his office. Violations of law or disregard for public safety and property on the part of an officer are intrinsically wrong. They are self-defeating in that they instill in the public mind like a disposition. The employment of legal means, no matter how worthy the end, is certain to encourage disrespect for the law and its officers. If the law is to be honoured, it must first be honoured by those who enforce it. This particular article suggests that we really need to be modelling the best behaviour, and this is what ethical officers are engaged in. There's what we call absolute and qualified rights as well, and the ways that we balance this up is often part of the process of thinking through ethical decision making. It's very much complex and open to considerable interpretation depending on the context, but there's generally a couple of things that help us to think about these balancing acts. So in terms of absolute rights, we've got things like the right to freedom, the right to life, and of course the right to freedom from torture, most importantly. And then we've got qualified rights, such as the right to privacy and the right to freedom of expression. So we need to make decisions about how something is ethical or not. weighing up these two extreme, I suppose, ends of a continuum, an ethical continuum. There are a lot of ethical dilemmas that present each day of our lives, and we think through these in different ways. There are situations in which people don't know the right course of action to take. They have difficulty doing what they consider to be right, and they find the wrong choice very tempting. So, for instance, things like homeless people being with children being turned away from a shelter. We know that that's not right, but there might be rules or regulations or just an apparent lack of beds, which mean we have to turn those people away. Some categories of dilemma involve discretion for police officers, duties, honesty, and loyalty as well. So, victims of crime, for instance, not being left with sufficient means to survive after a particular crime has happened. So, they might have had all of their money taken in a particular crime. That means they don't have money to survive, and the police officers walk away without making any recommendations about where these victims might be able to get assistance. Now, they might be able to get assistance in the long term where they apply for different forms of victim support, but it's certainly not immediate. And they might think, well, it's not my job to be a social worker and refer these people to a place where they can get vouchers and so forth, so I just won't bother. So these types of ethical dilemmas often present in the role of policing. And I would argue that discretion is a big one. That discretion is something that police have a lot of control over. And if they can see circumstances where people are coming into contact with the law simply because they have an apparent lack of accommodation or they have an apparent lack of resources to survive, then the onus is on them, if we do respect human rights and dignity, to try and help those people in one way or another so that they don't keep coming to the attention of the law. So if they use their discretion and say, you know what, instead of charging you with this offence, I'm just going to overlook it, and I'm instead going to assist by putting you onto this service that I know can actually help with what you're going through. And that could be a drug rehabilitation service. There's all sorts of different things that might be available to them. And it's through discretion that those things unfold. That's ethical dilemmas. There are also conflicts of interest, which is a very common ethical issue which emerges out of police work. This is when one's public duty conflicts with their private interests. So an officer might be required to act on suspected criminality, but their personal interests reduce their ability to be unbiased. So, for instance, it might be a junior police officer pulling over and breath testing a senior police officer that they work with. The senior officer is under the influence quite seriously of alcohol. The junior officer then makes a decision to just let them go. So that's where they can't be unbiased in their ability to do their duty. So would you charge your father or mother with stealing, for instance? A really good question. Would you charge the police commissioner in that instance with drink driving? These are key questions that come up quite often in the process of people doing their work. If we're all equal under the law, then these people are legally obliged to issue fines. And there's situations like this one with the New South Wales officer who lended their uniform to another friend so that they could go through a kink or fetish scene and use the uniform and handcuffs to do so. Officers must enforce the law regardless of how this conflicts with their personal interests, but they must also enforce the law in ways that are informed by human rights and dignity. So there's victimless crimes. They might think that sex work, for instance, should not be criminalised in any way, shape or form, but they've got to go to work and there might be a certain number of fines allocated to their daily KPIs or their weekly KPIs where they do actually need to issue those fines because it's criminalised in their state. So personally, they might not believe it, but they actually do have to do that as part of their job. So it's quite challenging stuff. And of course, there's things like noble cause corruption, which we talked about in the previous lecture, where they use deception and entrapment in order to get the crook and get them jailed so that they stop victimising people, which of course is a good thing, but the fact that they do that by dirty means is not a great way of doing things. It might be their own personal beliefs that what they're doing is good because they are getting these people behind bars, but that doesn't necessarily mean it aligns with the law. Some other ways of analysing ethical issues. There's thinking about what the law requires. You should have a lawful power, for instance. What does the organisational policy require? There's a huge amount of information in police organisations on this, and they probably do need to have time sometimes to check it. And of course, what do your own personal ethics require? How are you going to deal with people? So if your family found out that you made this decision to charge this particular person or bash them in the process of arresting them, what would they think about your decision to do that? There are different areas where ethical issues may emerge. There's things like leadership and command behaviour. There's supervisions and, of course, organisational structure. There's selection procedures where there's favouritism towards one person or another. And this is why in a lot of promotion processes they have the capacity to appeal. And then, of course, there's training, there's disciplinary systems, there's common values that police officers share, there's political conditions, and there's economic conditions. So all of these things might influence the way that different ethical issues and, most importantly, that ethical decision-making happens. So, for example, two officers come across a gay male. They're quite drunk at the time, the gay male that is, and that they're clearly not understanding what's going on around them. The officers might find that the gay male's wallet has lots and lots of money in it. They then decide to take that money and split it between them, and then they make the argument later on that the money wasn't there when they originally arrested that person for public drunkenness, right? So there's two things that are informing that. It's very much the economic conditions, the working conditions of the officers, and where they could use the money, right? But there's also the political and, I would argue, the socio-cultural issues. They've both been socialised to think that it's okay to be discriminatory towards this particular gay person. So there's another practical model of ethical decision making, if of course you have the time to go through that. The first question is it legal? Will I be violating a criminal or civil law or force policy? Is it balanced? Is it fair to all concerned in the short and long term? Does it promote a win-win situation, which unfortunately is not very often? How will I feel about myself? Will it make me feel proud? Would I feel good if the decision was published in a newspaper? And would I feel good if my family knew about this, which is something that I mentioned before? And there's that idea of the golden rule of the policing, which is dealing with people, how you would want your family to be dealt with. And in fact, this golden rule informs directly the Police Service of Northern Ireland's Code of Ethics. And it says police officers are required to treat the public in the way that they wish an officer to treat them or their own family. And they need to be able to do this when they're carrying out their duties, protecting human dignity and upholding human rights and so forth. So this is actually fairly rare to be written into a code of policing. And it is what we call the golden rule, and there is quite a bit of research about it as well. But look, that's all I needed to say about police ethics. I hope you can understand how that interacts with the way that we think about corruption in particular. And while it might be impossible to eradicate deviance altogether, these are ways that we can move forward in trying to at least reduce it as much as possible. And of course, ethical policing and ethical decision-making processes, I would argue, regardless of whether or not you're an officer, can be really useful in helping people to think through these types of things. That's all for now. I hope you're having a great day and you have a good week, and I'll chat to you all again soon. Laters!